Welcome, my name is Kawoferov. In today's Zero2Hero video, we are going to talk about the Cloud Templates YAML in VMware Cloud Assembly. We are going to cover the different input types we can have for our inputs in the blueprint editor. We're going to speak about how we can build compelling UI presentations and dropdowns without the help of custom forms. We're gonna give few examples of Cloud template expressions that we're going to use throughout our blueprint. We're going to cover the different types of namespaces and what information these provide us. And at the end, we're gonna see some advanced YAML manipulation. Let's start by creating a new blueprint. We're going to see the following fields in a brand new blueprint: format version, inputs, and resources. Format version notates the version of YAML which Cloud Assembly uses, cannot be changed. We're not gonna discuss it. We're gonna pay more attention to inputs and resources. Under inputs is where we are going to define and create all our presentation inputs, and under resources we're gonna see the YAML code for all the objects that we want to create. For example, if I drag and drop an object from the canvas from the left into the canvas, this is going to create a piece of YAML code to represent that object under resources. Before I move on with creating our first input, I must note that YAML is indent sensitive, so be very careful how you indent your code. The first thing I do when I start building new blueprints is output some comments at the very beginning of the blueprint. And you can do this by entering multi single line comments, as I did in this example. The hashtag notates a single line comment. And you can see the editor makes this foldable right away, which is pretty cool. At the end of this presentation, the blueprint which I'll be producing at the end will be available in my GitHub repo, and the video from this presentation is available in my YouTube channel. Now, I'm going to use a multi-line comment to add some more info about my blueprint. As you can see, this time I've used a multi-line comment. So I've created my own property, and I can do this throughout the entire YAML. And in this case, I call that property info. You can call it whatever you want. And I created as a value for that property just a multi-line comment to be used. I can add some more comments. What does this blueprint do, and so on, if I wish to. I'm just going to leave it at this for now. I also added a name property with the name of the blueprint, which is mainly used if I sync this blueprint to Git. As my blueprint grows and as I get multiple inputs and multiple resources, the YAML code can span across few hundred, even thousand lines. For me, in order to find easily where my inputs start, where my resources start, I tend to add comments like this throughout the blueprint. I'm going to add this notating that my inputs start here, and I'm going to add a similar one notating where my resources start. This is again just a single line comment used as a visual line separator of a sort. Now let's continue creating our first input. Now, one of the first things we need to create for the input is the type, and depending on the type we choose, we will see a particular set of properties available for this input. In this case, let's start with a simple string value, property from type string. Now if I check the inputs, I have some inputs which are related to string. I can set a default value, I can set a description, I can set a minimum or maximum length for this particular value to be entered during request time, or I can set a regex pattern to notate what are the allowed characters in this input. I can also edit all the settings from the Inputs tab. When I click on my input, I get a UI representation of all these properties. I can change again the time. I can select it as encrypted, as read-only. Again, select the minimum and maximum length of characters for this input, and so on and so on. Now if I click quickly deploy, we're going to see how this input looks like, and it's just a simple input where I can provide a string. Now again, what you see is an example of an input from type, again, string. In this case, I filled in some of the values listed here, filled in some of the properties, and I'm gonna add one more just as an example called flavor. Now again, flavor is from type string, and you can see again I added a comment property to both of them. Again, this is property I created, you can call it whatever you want, but I like to call it comment and provide some basic info on just for me what this property does for me, if I have to pay attention to something, and so on. I'm just gonna hide this for a sec. So we have two property from type string. I filled in some description that will appear in the info box for both. I've provided some default values and a more user-friendly title that will appear in the UI. So if I click deploy, I can see my user-friendly title values. I can see this one, the dropdowns with the values. I can see the information boxes providing some more info about those properties. And as you saw in that description, that information box, I've used a couple of basic HTML tags to make the text bold and to do line breaks just to make it more pretty. Now, the two string inputs use a different method of representing the values or the select choice to the end user. One uses oneOf as a drop-down kind of presentation method, and the other one uses enumeration as a way to represent the values to the end user. Enumeration, it represents just a list of values presented to the user. Oneof is a similar list of values, but it also provides us a way to give a user-friendly name for those values so that the user doesn't have to understand what those constants mean, because sometimes they may be very complex for the end user. So in this case, in the first image input, I'm storing the name of my image profiles and so on as constants, but I'm providing a more user-friendly title to the user so that he can easily understand what is being requested in this input and what he needs to select. Whereas in the second example for flavor, the values that the user will see are exactly the values which are being enumerated here as a list. And if I click deploy again, you can see here this. I get exactly the same enumeration input values, but here I have a user-friendly title for all of these. Next, I'm going to add two integer inputs as an example, called load balancer and web count. Again, these are from type integer. The load balancer one has this allows me to choose whenever I want to deploy or not a load balancer, and it's a integer with values 0 and 1 as a drop-down options, but I've provided a more user-friendly choice for the user to select yes or no to deploy a load balancer. The web count property, again, it's integer. It has a default value 0 or 1 if I want to start with a single web front-end server for my 3-tier application, and it allows for this web front-end server to span up to 10 servers. Therefore, I've defined minimum and maximum integer values between 0 and 10. Next, I'm going to add two inputs from type array, called tags optional and tags required, and these are from type array. Now, what I use or will use these inputs for in my blueprint later on, I wanted to have a set of tags which will always be applied to all provisioned objects as a required tags. This may notate the project from which these deployments are coming so that I can do reporting later on or any other purpose. And I also wanted to give the ability to the user to provide a additional optional tags that will be attached to those deployments. The optional may include the cost center or some additional business information that the user may want to provide. Now later on, when I use why are those from type array, because if I drag and drop, for example, a machine resource in my canvas, I can see under properties tags. This is where I want those tags to be applied. I can see that the tag value is an array that has child fields key and value, which provide the input for the tags. Therefore, I've defined my two inputs from type array, right? And for the required one, where I wanted to insert a couple of default values, I've entered these under the defaults property, and because I didn't want the user to be able to change them, I've also set an additional property, read-only true. For the optional one, I haven't set the read-only property, therefore the user can add new array members or tags, and I've also defined for the key and value inputs, the key and value inputs that also need to be passed here, that I've defined the pattern property describing that only hyphens, underscores, and lowercase characters and numbers are allowed for tag values. How does this looks like? If I check the presentation UI, I can see my required tags being listed, which I cannot change. This is due to the read-only property, and I can see the optional tags which the user can change and add new tag values. And if I try to enter a character which is not allowed by my pattern, I won't be able to save it, and I will get this error saying this input must be compliant with the pattern required. Now I'm gonna add a couple more examples for different presentation inputs, and I'm gonna explain them quickly one by one. I'm gonna start with this again, a simple array that in this case has one default value in form of a kind of drop-down input. How does this looks like? This is the simple array, and I can add additional values if needed, or change the default one and add another one. Now let's build on top of this array example. Let's expand it a bit, and again I've created an input from type array. In this case, the items, they're not just drop-down items anymore, but these are now a complex object. So I have an array of objects, and at the end, those objects are strings which I need to provide. How does this looks like in the UI? Array of objects, object and array of object strings. In this case, I can provide my inputs here. And these will appear as an array members here. Now, the next one is exactly the same as the previous one. It is an array of objects. The previous one was array of objects of type string, and this is an array of objects of type object, and at the end again we are providing a string as a value. How does this differ in the UI? This is the next array of objects. In this case, in order to provide the key value, I have this object here, and inside it I can provide the key value pairs, and I can provide more if I want to, or I can add another object here and again provide some other values. Now, if I want to expand this even further, I can create an array again of objects as the previous one, array of objects, but then instead of using the default string inputs which we provide here, I have defined some property for my string inputs. I have set, and I'm doing exactly the same as in the previous example where I use a pattern for the tags property, where I have defined a pattern that the tags can have, and so on. I'm using exactly the same approach here. I'm defining some properties for my string inputs, and in particular for the key and value string inputs. And in the UI, it will look very similar to the previous, except when I enter here the key value pairs, I can also have the pattern validation coming from the properties of these keys, and I can add more if I want to. Right? And I can see the key value pairs. And the final one is again an array of objects, this time of strings, but for the objects I have defined a different properties. I have defined multiple columns. One is from type string, the second one is from type number, the third one is from type string. The first one has some enumeration values provided, again the same as our very first example, and the other one has a number input with minimum and maximum values and a default value, again as we showed in a previous example. And this will be visualized as a type of a data grid in the UI. Let's check it out. This is an array of objects, type data grid. And if I open to add a value, I can see my dropdown, which is my first property column. And I can see my second one, where I can select an input, and the third one where I can enter a simple string text. Now let's add a resource to our blueprint and start referring those values and see how we can refer some of these more complex array inputs. So I've added a machine, a network element on my canvas, and I've provided it with some constraint tags coming as inputs. I'm just going to fill in these in the inputs properties. I'm just going to paste the entire inputs from my final blueprint, and we already covered the more important ones from these. The other ones are just overlap of functionality. I'm just going to minimize all these inputs so that we can see more clearly what is happening in the YAML. Okay. Again, you have access at the end to this entire blueprint. So these are all my inputs which I need for my final blueprint, and let's start accessing some of those. Now, under each object that I drag and drop from the canvas, if I go under properties, I can see all of the properties defined in the schema for that particular object. In this case, I'm on a network object. I can provide constraints, constraint tags. This is from type array, and you can see it here. I can provide description property, name property, net mask, network type, and so on and so on. Right? I'm not going to go into the properties for the different resource objects from the canvas. Most of the time, these are pretty straightforward. But rather, I will show you how you can refer some of the more complex input properties. Now, if I want to define my own property, which does not exist here in the schema for this object, I can do so very easily by just specifying some name. Let's say my property. And now let's say I want to refer some of the input values which we entered earlier. So for example, if I want to refer to the value which was entered in, let's say, the flavor input, I can do $input dot flavor. And this will give me the value that I provide through this input. Now, this should not be, although I call these custom properties, this should not be confused with the custom properties in V-Ray 7 or with other types of properties that you may see throughout uh, the blueprint. I call them YAML custom properties as their lifetime is only limited throughout the run of the YAML and can only be defined in the YAML. Now, if I'm defining such properties, I usually will define them under properties in my resource objects. If these are properties which will be used throughout the entire YAML multiple times, meaning I may use them on the same inputs on other objects as well throughout the canvas. I don't want to repeat myself in case I change some of these properties, and of course these can be static values that I can just provide here, right? And let's say I want to have this my property. I have a typo here, and I want to assign it to multiple machine objects which are I have drag and drop to the canvas, or multiple other elements. What I like doing for such properties is I will define them once, typically on the first object that gets provisioned throughout the blueprint, right? So if this is a typical blueprint where I have multiple machines, objects connected to that application, network and so on, maybe have a couple of additional disks here connected to those VMs, maybe a load balancer as well, as we are going to see at the end. One way to have this property, I like to create it on the first object which will get created from my blueprint, and typically this is always the network. In case your blueprint has a network, the network will be the first object created. Therefore, the values I define under my network resource will be available for reference later on by other objects which get provisioned by the blueprint. So, for example, if I want to define my property and refer to my property, let's say here in, just for an example, maybe in flavor. Instead of accessing this property, define this property here manually, for example, like this, I may want to refer from the property which I defined earlier on my network. So I will do something like this. I will say I want to access the resource, what is called a resource namespace. I want to access my application network properties, and from there I want to assign the value of my prop. And this will, during provisioning, this will refer to the value given here. Sometimes this may make sense. Sometimes to do this approach where you store the property on one element and reference it throughout all others, sometimes it may not make sense to do so. And I'm going to leave it up to you to decide which one to use. And of course, I can reference that property in create a new custom property for this particular cloud machine and reference the above property as well. I'm just going to copy this here and say I have my property 2, for example, defined here, and I want to refer to the value of this property which comes from, or let's leave it my prop again, same name for the property under different resources. I can do exactly the same thing. I can access the resource namespace, and I can for duplication network, and I can refer to that property. Why do I want to add refer to some property values under properties? Because everything which is under properties uh, gets attached to the object payload, and if I put a particular value here in form of a custom property, particular value I may need, I can later on access it in the event payload during extensibility, either through Vero or ABX, and be able to read it. More about extensibility and how to read the payload, you can find in the other Zero2Hero videos which I created and are available in my YouTube channel. Okay, and because this is now not a custom property I'm defining new for this resource, but rather than this, I'm inheriting this custom property value from a different resource. I usually put it under inherited custom properties, just so that I visually know that from where this is coming from. It's being inherited from another object on the canvas, and it's not defined locally for this object, right? And I can easily define another walk or prop and give it again some value. And this is more of a custom property defined locally for the machine object. This is more of a custom property being inherited from somewhere else in the canvas, right? I'm gonna remove this machine object for a bit now, or leave it to showcase my next example. Now you also see there is something here which I've called namespace properties, and these are properties which come from two particular namespaces called environment and self, and these provide also a lot of useful out-of-the-box information regarding the deployment and the resource which you're deploying, and I like listing them all here during development time so that I can see if I maybe can use some of these values. And I'm gonna copy them here. You can see all these namespace properties are coming from two what we call namespaces, $sign self and $sign env later on, right? And of course you can see all of these values being listed here. The self one provides you access to all the properties from the object from which you're calling this environment variable self. For example, in this case, I'm calling the option from the machine blueprint, so it will provide me access to all the properties which are assigned to the object myself, the cloud machine resource. If I access the environment namespace, this will give me access to some environment properties like the blueprint ID, from which this deployment got triggered, the blueprint name, blueprint version, deployment ID, deployment name, org ID, project ID, project name, and so on and so on, right? Who requested the blueprint, the email or username of the user, and so on. And these are cool pieces of information, again, which I can later on maybe use during extensibility, just because, like we said, if I put them under properties, these become part of our payload. Okay, now I'm gonna copy paste the machine YAML code for my final example. Now I'm gonna remove this for the time being. Now let's see how we can reference some of these more complex inputs we have defined at the very beginning. As we said, the standard way to reference them are by clicking $, input, and then the name of the input I want to reference, right? And you can see me doing so here multiple times. For the flavor, I'm hitting input.flavor, which will refer to my input, which is called flavor, to get the value, and so on and so on, right? Now, this is simple enough. This is also available in the official documentation. Here, I'm assigning some constraints, again, coming from these are strings or key value pairs coming from different inputs again, right? Now, you can see me here for resource group name. I'm actually referring to one of those inherited properties which I have defined in my application network, right? So in this case, the resource group name property will be something I would have defined here to say what the value of that resource group property is, right? And I can then refer it the same way I explained earlier through the application network. Now, if we look again at the inputs, again, the flavor one was just an enumeration of a drop-down list of values, but let's take a look at the image one, which is again from type string as the flavor, but this time it uses the oneOf method to provide a more user-friendly titles to particular constants, particular enumeration items to the user. And as you can see, for some of these constants, I've actually added multiple string values separated by, in this case, by comma. I can separate them by anything I want to. Now, what was my use case for this, and what does this give me? Well, I wanted to say that if the user selects a particular image for the machine provisioning, that image, if that machine is provisioned on vSphere, I also want to use a particular customization spec coming from vSphere. And in this case, this would be the name of my image profile as defined in my infrastructure tab, and this will be the name of my my customization spec as defined in vSphere. And if the user selects CentOS 7.4 version 01, this will go to the image profile 01 in my infrastructure tab, and maybe select the custom spec, which is 01. If the user selects CentOS version 02, my custom corporate image, this will go and select a different customization spec from vCent, right? And I didn't want to burden the user having to know which image version is tied to which spec and provide them both as inputs, because the end user may not be familiar with this, may not know what this means, and so on. So I wanted to create this binding between an image profile and a custom spec. And in this case, I've just provided both values together in the same string. In this case, that's the constant strings you see here. Now, more interesting is how I reference those values later on in my blueprint. Now, in order to a fancy way to do so is to split that input string based on the comma. So I'm saying I want to access input image, my input image property. I want to split the value based on the comma. Again, going back to this example, we can see the comma here in the constant value, we can see it here in the constant value, and so on. Again, I can use any other symbol instead of comma, but I found out comma to be a good example. And I'm saying once this is being split, if I want to access the first element of that split, or that's the first string return before the first comma, which will be, for example, this one, and this will be the second string return from the split, I can access them like I can usually access array members in pretty much any programming language, right? If I'm accessing the, in this case, the image, which is the first value, how do you access the first member in an array? It is numbered as 0, so I'm accessing it by like I'm accessing array member 0. So this will return me the first value in my split string, which will be the image profile name. The second value in my split string, which I can access as like the first array member value, will be my customization spec, and I've assigned this to my customization spec property part of my my machine resource. Now, this is a nice way of grouping multiple related string values together as one user input and referencing them throughout the YAML. Now, if I, for example, extend this and I add another value, let's say I don't want the user to select flavor. I want the flavor to be related based on the image version they enter. I can say for image version 02, the default flavor should be, let's say, medium. And for version 01 of my image, that should be maybe small, just an example, right? And then I'll go ahead and delete my flavor input. And later on, where I'm referencing that flavor input, instead of referencing the flavor input, I will reference now the third value coming from that split, image split, which will give me value, flavor profile, medium or small, right? Depending which one I'm selecting. Now let's see how we can access some of these complex arrays which we created at the beginning. And let me just quickly minimize this again to be, I'm gonna delete the DB server for now, the machine resource, just to keep it simple. Minimize the volumes, the volume. That's the tag. That is that's the other one. Resource type. Okay. Now, in a similar fashion as I was accessing the members of that image value input after the split, I can access the array members coming from a complex array inputs. And let's take the first one that we created earlier. Right? Now, if I want to access the value of this array input, I will again do exactly the same thing. I will define my custom property, and I am doing this on the network just because it's the first element which will get created during provisioning, so I can reference this value anywhere through my blueprint afterwards if I want to. Let's say my array input, and again I will do $, use the input namespace to access that input. Now, because this is an array, if I leave it like this should give me all members of the array. If I want to access the first member of this array, I will click enter 0. If I want to access the second member, I will enter 1. If I want to access the third member, I will enter 2, and so on. So which members are we talking about? I'm talking about the members which are in this case listed here, right? First member, second member, third member, and I can access them by entering 0, 1, or 2. Now, this is for the example for the simple array that we had, and I've listed all of these examples here. Access all members, access the first one and the second one. Now, if we move to the object array of objects of type string, or this is the second example here where we enter different tags here. How do we reference this one? Again, very similar approach. Now, because all the custom properties which I create on my own under properties do not exist in the schema, I cannot define from what type these are. So these are by default always created as string. So this would be string. Any other custom property I add here will again be string. But the inputs which I'm currently trying to assign to these custom properties are from type array. So in order to convert all of these to strings, I'm using the toString method, and all these methods are available in the Qt Assembly official documentation. There is a chapter on Qt Assembly expression evaluations, and you can find them all there. But as you see throughout all the custom properties listed here, I'm always using doing first toString in order to get the string value as a representation from that array. Now back to the example. This time I'm saying input and accessing the members of array object string input, right? And in this case, if I want to access the members of the first the object group, I'm going to access them again with 0. This would be this would give me this first property. Then I can this one already exists, and if I add more, this is my first array member, second array member, third array member, right? And I can access them by again doing 0 to access the first one, doing 1 to access the second one, and in this case I'm explicitly saying the name of the property I'm accessing, which is again the name defined here, right? I have an array of objects of strings, and the property I want to return in this case is called CG tag, so I'm explicitly referring to that one. CG tag is the name which is behind this value. This is just the user-friendly value given in my blueprint, as you can see here. Similar to this, if I create an array of objects, I will be, again, I can access the first element of that array by saying 0, then the property I want to access, and then the particular key I want to access, right? How does this look like in the UI? This is the next one. This is here where I'm entering an object, has key 0, or let's say my key, my value, right? My key, my value, add it here. Now, if I want to access that the value which I created for my key, So if I want to access this particular value, I need to access that key in the YAML, right? And again, I do it here by saying from the first array object, return the CG tag property name, or the property that has CG tag name, and from the multiple values there, return me the one which has as a key my key, right? So this will return this one. If I add another one, if I want to refer to this value in my YAML, I will use this key in the YAML here in this way, right? I will say my access my other key. And if I want to access the whole property as a key value pair, I can do so by just accessing CG tag, and this will return me both the key and the value pairs, right? And in a similar way, I've done it for the rest of those example array input examples. The final one, which I'm going to just spend a couple minutes on, is the data grid object, which we have defined at the very end, right? That has a different types of inputs for the different data grid objects. If I open the example here or expand the input here, I can see again it's an array of object of in this case the object members or the different object properties which are members have different types. One has string, one has number, one has again string. And these properties have different names: column 1, column 2, column 3. I can code them whatever I want. In one of my previous examples, I code these properties CG tag, right? Here I call them column 1, column 2, column 3. And if I want to access them again in a very similar fashion, I'm going to say from my input array object, from object data grid, which is my input name, access element 0, and in particular access column 1. Or access element 0, give me the value of column 2, give me the value of column 3. If I want all three values returned, I'll just say I will omit the array member selection and just return all of them. And now I'm gonna copy paste the final YAML example here and run a simple deployment so that we can check all those inputs that we have created. So I've pasted my final YAML here. I'm gonna run a simple deployment with default values, and I'm gonna enter here some more values to my example arrays. Second value, I'm gonna add a couple of value 0, maybe add one more, value 1, add a couple of values here, that is key 0, value 0, apply, maybe add one more, key 1, value 1, add a couple here, key 0. This one cannot has capital letters because we entered the pattern. So I'm going to use all small caps. And let's say gold 80, simple string, value, not another one, silver 100, another string value. and hit deploy. And in a couple of seconds, you see again the first object which gets created is my network. So all the custom properties I have defined on my network will now be shown right away. And I can see the elements from my data grid, which I entered at the very last gold, silver with the appropriate values. And I can access them all at once, or I can access particular data grid properties and values. And these are all the examples coming from the blueprint, where I've entered how to access. I have shown how to access all of these properties. Right, this is what is being listed um, in the deployment details. Same goes for the other array examples, input examples. The array object input, it gives me all the inputs. I can reference them all one by one throughout the through the different members, and you can see the same for all the other array inputs. My most simple array, I can list all properties, all members of the array which I entered, or list the first one, which is default value, or list the second one, which is a second value, and so on and so on. And I can see my some other custom properties which I created here just as an example. Now, as I said, everything we see under custom properties and all the values which we explicitly created for our custom properties, including these here, are all listed when we check the event payload for the particular deployment. So for example, I would see these custom properties in the event payload of that particular resource object. I can see my array values, default array, second array, which refer to the properties assigned here. I would see my scroll down a bit, I would see my array object string inputs with values 0 and 1, and so on and so on. And we can use all of these during extensibility to get some more information.